Reactions and responses to sexual violence. This presentation was borrowed and adapted with permission from Danny Lidner. While the impact of sexual assault is unique to each individual, several factors can be considered. The victim-survivor's cultural context, available support systems, prior coping resources and abilities, biological and/or physiological responses, the nature of the victimization, any prior victimization experiences, and the social context in which all of the above occur. And this is considered the impact wheel. Here are some common reactions or responses. However, not all victims will experience the following reactions or responses, but again, these are common for many victims. There's the physical. This is physical to pain depending on the amount of physical force used, if any, sleeping pattern changes, nightmares, decrease in appetite, nausea, stomach pains, irritation or pain of the mouth, throat, vagina, or anus. There's also the fears or phobia, and it's not being believed, things reminiscent of the assault, so they're scared of certain seasons, locations, sounds, or smells. They're scared of retaliation by the rapist, or of people finding out about the assault, name being made public by the media, getting pregnant, contracting an STI or HIV. Then there are emotional reactions. These can be self-blame, guilt, shame and/or humiliation, anger, rage, and anxiety. There are also changes in lifestyles. There are different levels of functioning, less social, change of residence, leaving a school, leaving a job, and others a lot like that. Rape trauma syndrome, also known as RTS. This is an older term that was created to explain what a survivor goes through and experiences after a sexual assault. So it describes a process that survivors go through in response to the fear experienced during sexual assault. Each survivor has their own experience. RTS describes the common characteristics victims experience due to the profound fear inherent in sexual assault. Again, it's going to be different for everyone. Victims consistently describe certain common reactions. Some of these reactions occur immediately after their experience. Others may set in after time has passed. There is no normal or right way for victims and survivors of sexual violence to feel or react. Each individual has their own experience, and it is important to note that whether a victim or survivor experiences all of these common reactions or none of them, it is their own reaction and it is normal. RTS has multiple phases. Phase 1 is the impact phase, and this phase can last from just a few moments to up to a few weeks. During this stage, a large variety of emotions may be present. Disorganization and disorientation characterize the reaction of the victim and survivors. And feelings of shock and disbelief are very, very strong and present. The person is operating at a high emotional level, and their normal coping skills may be unavailable at this point. Dealing both with their emotions and decision-making can seem overwhelming to victims and survivors in the impact stage. So enabling victims and survivors to make decisions and express their feelings and validate their feelings is very important during this stage. This is typically when they're also in crisis mode. Again, they're disorganized and disoriented. They may not know what they're hearing, saying, or doing. And the advocate's role, again, in this time, is to re-empower the choices and allow them the opportunity to express themselves, their thoughts, fear, concerns, confusions, and validate these feelings. Anything is normal at this stage. The second phase in RTS is outward adjustment. This phase can last from days to years. Outward adjustment is an attempt by the victim or survivor to shut off the reality of what they have experienced. This is a completely natural reaction in an attempt to restore some normalcy to their life. Victims and survivors may appear outwardly to have adjusted, but generally have not resolved the sexual violence they have experienced. They may not want to discuss the assault or deal with it in any way. Victims and survivors may not approach sexual violence crisis centers in this stage. Concrete information about options can be valuable for victims and survivors. However, if they decide to seek supportive services at a later time. It is also important to reassure victims and survivors that they can seek supportive services and contact their local sexual violence crisis center at any time and when they feel they are ready to do so. Stage 3 or Phase 3 of RTS is resolution. This stage begins with the desire to work on the issues of the assault. The victim or survivor recognizes their feelings. If a victim or survivor is feeling angry at this time, they may be able to focus that anger on the perpetrator only. They may be able to recognize some of their own strengths and courage that has enabled them to reach this point. Counseling may be important in this phase. The victim or survivor need to have their feelings heard and hear options available to them at this point. Resolution is a phase that may come and go for victims and survivors. It represents a huge step in the healing process and can be very, very challenging. The final phase of RTS is integration. Integration is as much an attitude as it is a phase. It represents the culmination of everything the victim or survivor has experienced. The victim or survivor has accepted the fact that the sexual violence has occurred. Moreover, they have integrated this fact into themselves as another life event with a large impact. It does not have the ruling impact, however, so they will control it instead of it controlling them. The victim survivor has changed and grown. They have accepted the knowledge that parts of their former outlook are gone forever. They have acknowledged the new aspects of themselves that have developed. As a victim survivor begins to integrate this experience, they may not feel the need to access their sexual violence crisis center anymore, but it is important for sexual violence advocates to let their clients know that they will still be there if the client wants to check in sometime in the future. Because the victim or survivor has begun the process of integration does not mean that they are completely healed from the sexual violence and will not need support from time to time later in their life. Many victims will experience some of the reactions or responses identified in rape trauma syndrome, but not all victims will have these experiences. Similarly, some, but not all victims will experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or be diagnosed with PTSD. What RTS and PTSD do have in common is that they both identify reactions that are normal for having experienced a traumatic event. They have also been criticized for quantifying reactions to the human experience of trauma. Rape trauma syndrome is something that grew out of the early days of the anti-rape movement. It's specific to the lasting effects of sexual assault only, and it recognizes two styles of reactions. Expressive, which is where the victim or survivor expresses stereotypical responses to trauma with crying, rage, sobbing, hysteria, tenseness, anxiousness, restlessness, and etc. And then the other one is controlled, which is where the victim is calm, numb, in shock, quiet, composed, reserved, and they have difficulty expressing themselves, etc. Roughly half of victim survivors have an expressive style, half exhibit the controlled style. Because the former fits our stereotypes for a trauma victim or survivor, it is inviting to consider that the controlled styled response must be a person who is not being truthful. It is important to help others understand that both responses to trauma are normal and expected. The controlled response is as much an expected response to trauma as the expressive. So PTSD is recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, also known as the DSM, in the 1970s after the Vietnam War. PTSD addresses trauma across assault, war, accidents, and any other violent or traumatic event, and describes many of the same symptoms and experiences as rape trauma syndrome. RTS and PTSD have both received some criticism. So for RTS, some have criticized it does not have a strong empirical basis. Also, the term syndrome makes it seem like they are regarding or treating the person as psychologically abnormal or unhealthy. PTSD has scientific validity, but it also has been criticized for treating or regarding someone as psychologically abnormal or unhealthy. Previously, we have covered RTS in the 4 phases. So why don't we go over PTSD a little bit? So PTSD occurs when a person has been exposed to a traumatic event involving actual or threatened serious physical injury or death, and the person's response involves intense fear, helplessness, or horror. The trauma is persistently re-experienced in one or more of the following ways: recurrent and intrusive distressing recollections of the event, recurrent distressing dreams of the event, and or acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were reoccurring, flashbacks, hallucinations, dissociative episodes, etc. The person persistently avoids stimuli associated with the trauma and experiences numbing of general responsiveness, such as feelings of detachment or estrangement from others, efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, and or marked diminished interest or participation in significant activities, etc. Persistent syndromes of increased arousal, such as difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability or outbursts of anger, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, or exaggerated startled response, are also symptoms of PTSD. Simply put, victims or survivors of trauma do not control or make choices to relive the traumatic experience. Rather, because of PTSD, the part of the brain that controls the body's response to danger, also known as the amygdala, short-circuits, so to say, the rational part of the brain, and releases stress hormones to help the body survive. It triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response. While that is a useful and life-saving technique we need, victims and survivors of trauma often experience a return to that survival response that is triggered when something reminds the person of the traumatic event. Most often, these memories are triggered by the senses. A smell, sound, vision, etc. can alert the body that it must move into protective mode. Many clinicians say that this is survival mode that hijacks the rational response and takes the victim back into the traumatic memories. Unfortunately, when a person has experienced PTSD from sexual assault, there is not likely a predator around the corner when they are triggered by a sight, sound, smell, or taste. The trauma response releases adrenaline, which can result in a racing pulse, sweating palms, rapid breathing, tunnel vision, or other symptoms sometimes associated with panic attacks. Adrenaline surges are short-lived and hard on the body. Often, the result is exhaustion. The reaction can also make a victim feel like they are going crazy. So basically, the people experiencing PTSD from sexual assault aren't typically triggered by seeing someone around the corner. They're triggered by a certain sight, a certain sound, a smell, or a taste. So how do you help someone if they are in the middle of having a flashback? Well, first, name it. Not everyone realizes they're in a flashback. Tell the victim that it may feel real to them, but that it is not happening again. And encourage them. Encourage the survivor to take slow, gentle breaths. And remind the survivor that they are only remembering. And keep reminding the victim that they are in a safe place now. If a person is having a flashback, you may want to try to ground them or bring them back to reality, bring them out of that flashback. So you can do this by asking the survivor to describe out loud where they are and to name the colors, sights, sounds, smells, and ask the survivor to do something physical, such like wiggling their toes or stomping their feet on the ground or opening or repeatedly blinking their eyes. So trauma response and advocates. So the constellation of symptoms that define PTSD are normal reactions to abnormal stress. Those who do suffer from PTSD tend to work to avoid the stimuli that are re-traumatizing. This is another normal response. So this may mean a survivor may not want to keep an appointment with an advocate because the meeting means being reminded of the assault. You can help normalize this fear by talking about it. Not keeping appointments may not at all be about disinterest in the process, but more about avoiding stimuli that is re-traumatizing. So during a traumatic event, there have been some things found out about memory, which can also be called the memory phenomenon in traumatic situations. So during the traumatic incident, the people are in sensory overload. They're fixed on a certain aspect and they're missing so many other details and other important information. Right after the incident, or post-incident amnesia as it's called, there's a failure to remember most of what was being observed. They don't necessarily recall much of anything. After a healthy night's sleep, there's memory recovery. It results in remembering a majority of what occurred, probably the most pure and accurate recollection. Within 72 hours after the assault or event, this is when there's going to be the final and most complete memory, but at least partially reconstructed after normal process of integration other sources of information. So which means some of the information may be brought back into memories by other sources that aren't necessarily related to the incident. So for example, law enforcement officers who encounter an extremely stressful situation will consistently exhibit difficulty in transferring information into long-term memory. Victims of sexual violence will often face memory challenges as well. So a traumatic memory that is fragmented, it's out of sequence, and it can be gapped, like they're missing sections, missing time. Details may be recalled over time. So characteristics of trauma, and it's not made up, it's not fabrication. Some very specific details or snapshots about one aspect and no details at all about another aspect of the trauma is normal. Frozen fear is a common neurological reaction and out of victims' control. So they don't necessarily have control on what they're remembering and what they're not remembering. PTSD and RTS are not the only two mental health issues someone who has experienced sexual violence can have. So they can also develop anxiety, a panic disorder, major depression, substance abuse and dependence, somatization, an eating disorder, or a dissociative disorder. So women with abuse histories and trauma syndromes may face a wide range of other mental health issues, but not all victims of sexual violence will develop any mental health issues. It's specific to each victim or survivor. So what are somatic issues? So a victim or survivor may develop chronic pain, especially in the pelvic region. They may have gynecological difficulties. They may develop asthma or other breathing issues. They may have heart palpitations and headaches. They may also have musculoskeletal difficulties.